Once upon a time, in the heart of a faraway land, there lived a girl named Bolu. Bolu was not like other children in her village. While most children had parents to care for them, Bolu was an orphan. Her parents had passed away when she was just a little girl, leaving her in the care of her old grandmother. Now, some children might have felt sorry for themselves, but not Bolu. No, Bolu was as brave and as strong as a baobab tree, and her heart was as kind as the golden rays of the morning sun. Bolu and her grandmother lived in a small hut at the edge of the village. It was a humble home, made of mud walls and a thatched roof, but it was filled with warmth and love. Bolu's grandmother, known to everyone as Mama Aduni, was a wise old woman. She had lived many years and had seen many things. People from all over the village would come to her for advice, for she knew the secrets of the earth and the sky, the herbs of the forest and the stories of their ancestors. From a young age, Bolu had watched her grandmother closely. She would sit beside her, eager to learn everything Mama Aduni knew. The old woman taught her how to gather herbs from the forest, how to mix them to heal wounds, and how to make potions that would cure even the worst fevers. Mama Aduni also taught Bolu the importance of kindness and generosity. Bolu, she would say, a heart that gives is a heart that grows. Never forget that. And Bolu never did. Though they had little, Bolu and her grandmother shared what they had with those in need. Bolu was known throughout the village for her gentle spirit and her willingness to help others. Children loved her because she always had a smile on her face and a game to play. The elders respected her because she treated them with honor. The sick and the poor were grateful for her because she never turned them away. One day, news spread through the village like wildfire. The great King Olumide, who ruled over their land, had fallen terribly ill. The king's palace was far from Bolu's hut, but everyone knew of his sickness. The king had been strong and just, ruling the land with fairness and wisdom, but now no one knew what had come over him. Some whispered that it was a curse. Others said it was just a terrible disease. The best healers in the land were summoned to the palace, but none could find a cure. The king grew weaker and weaker with each passing day, and his people began to fear that he might die. Desperate to find a cure, the king made a proclamation. "Whoever can heal me of this illness," he declared, "shall receive half of my kingdom as a reward." The news of this promise spread far and wide. Healers from every corner of the land traveled to the palace, hoping to be the one to save the king and claim the reward. But none of their medicines worked, and the king's condition continued to worsen. One night, as Bolu and Mama Aduni sat by the fire, a young man from the village burst into their hut. His eyes were wide with fear, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Mama Aduni, you must come quickly. The king's men are here. They are searching for you." Mama Aduni nodded gravely. "I knew this day would come," she said softly. She rose slowly from her seat, her old bones creaking as she did. "Bolu, help me gather the herbs." Bolu quickly fetched the herbs her grandmother needed. She knew that Mama Aduni had long prepared for this day, for the old woman had often spoken of the king in her stories. She had told Bolu that the king was a good man, but that even good men could be struck down by illness. The king's men arrived at the hut just as Mama Aduni and Bolu finished packing their things. "Hurry! The king's time is running out. Hurry now!" one of the soldiers said urgently. Mama Aduni and Bolu were taken to the palace, where they were led into the king's chamber. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. King Olumide lay in his bed, his once strong body now frail and weak. His skin was pale, and his eyes were dull with pain. He could barely lift his head as they approached. "Your Majesty," Mama Aduni said respectfully, bowing low before the king. "I have come to help." The king's voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. "If you can help me, wise woman, you shall have half of my kingdom, as I have promised." Mama Aduni nodded. "I do not seek your riches, your majesty. I only wish to do what is right." With that, Mama Aduni set to work. She carefully prepared a potion using the herbs she had brought with her, while Bolu watched her every move. The room was filled with a tense silence as everyone waited to see if the old woman's remedy would work. After what felt like hours, Mama Aduni finally handed the potion to the king. "Drink this, your majesty," she instructed. "It will cleanse your body of the sickness." The king hesitated for a moment, but then he drank the potion. The taste was bitter, but he swallowed every drop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly but surely, color began to return to the king's cheeks. His strength began to return, and his eyes brightened with life once more. The palace erupted in cheers. The king was healed. Word spread quickly through the land, and people rejoiced in the streets. King Olumide, who had been at death's door, was now well again, thanks to Mama Aduni and her granddaughter Bolu. But when the time for the king to fulfill his promise came, something unexpected happened. Instead of giving Mama Aduni and Bolu half of his kingdom as he had promised, the king gave them only a few coins. "Take this," the king said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It is enough to feed yourself and your hungry family." Mama Aduni and Bolu were stunned. This was not what they had expected, and certainly not what the king had promised, but they did not argue. Mama Aduni bowed her head and accepted the coins graciously, and Bolu followed her lead. "Thank you, your majesty," Mama Aduni said quietly. "We will make do with what you have given us." The villagers, however, were not so forgiving. They were outraged by the king's broken promise. How could he treat the woman who had saved his life so poorly? They grumbled and whispered amongst themselves, but none dared to speak out against the king openly. Bolu and her grandmother returned to their house, and life went on as usual. They continued to help those in need, sharing what little they had with others. Though they were disappointed by the king's action, they did not let it change who they were. But the story does not end there, for fate has a way of balancing the scales. When Bolu and Mama Aduni returned home after the king's meager reward, they did not allow the sting of injustice to linger in their hearts. Though the villagers murmured in anger on their behalf, Bolu and her grandmother continued their lives with quiet dignity. They helped those in need, tended their small garden, and lived humbly. However, deep down, Bolu couldn't completely shake the feeling of betrayal. She had never asked for riches, but the king's broken promise left a bitter taste in her mouth. As the months passed, life in the village settled back into its usual rhythm, but something changed for Mama Aduni. Her once strong spirit began to fade, and her health started to decline. Perhaps it was age finally catching up to her. Mama Aduni grew weaker with each passing day. Despite Bolu's best efforts, using all the herbs and remedies her grandmother had taught her, nothing could stop the inevitable. One quiet evening, Mama Aduni called Bolu to her bedside. Her voice was faint, but her eyes were clear and filled with love. "Bolu, my child," she whispered, "you have been my greatest joy and comfort in this world. You have learned much and your heart is pure. But life will not always be kind, as you have already seen. Promise me, Bolu, that you will continue to be kind no matter what happens." Bolu nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Mama." With a gentle smile, Mama Aduni closed her eyes for the last time, leaving Bolu alone in a world that suddenly felt much colder. The village mourned Mama Aduni's passing, for she had been a beacon of wisdom and kindness. Bolu buried her grandmother in the village cemetery, under the shade of a great baobab tree, and tried to find solace in the knowledge that Mama Aduni was now with the ancestors. But the void left by her grandmother's absence was deep, and for the first time, Bolu truly felt the weight of her orphanhood. A few weeks after the burial, a man arrived at the village. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and dressed in the fine city clothes that marked him as an outsider. He introduced himself as Uncle Kola, one of Bolu's distant relatives. He had heard of Mama Aduni's passing and had come to take Bolu to the city where she could start a new life. At first, Bolu was hesitant. The village was all she had ever known, and the idea of leaving behind the only home she had seemed overwhelming. But Uncle Kola was kind, and he assured her that she would be welcomed into his home like one of his own children. He promised her opportunities she could never have in the village: education, a comfortable life, and the chance to see the world beyond the small community she had grown up in. Reluctantly, Bolu agreed. She packed her few belongings, said her goodbyes to the villagers, and left with Uncle Kola for the bustling city. Life in the city was unlike anything Bolu had ever imagined. The streets were noisy and crowded, filled with people from all walks of life. Tall buildings rose into the sky, and merchants sold their wares at every corner, and the air was thick with the smell of cooking food, exhaust, and the hum of conversation. Uncle Kola's home was large and comfortable, with more rooms than Bolu could count, and for the first time in her life, she slept in a bed with soft sheets and pillows. Uncle Kola's family welcomed Bolu warmly. She was enrolled in school, where she quickly excelled, and she made new friends in the neighborhood. After school and during weekends, Bolu worked in her uncle's shop, learning the trade of selling fabrics and helping with the household chores. Though it was hard work, Bolu was grateful for the opportunity. She made friends and slowly began to feel at home in the city. A year passed and Bolu had settled into her new life. She missed her grandmother dearly but held on to the lessons Mama Aduni had taught her. Whenever she found the time, Bolu would visit the local market to buy herbs, continuing to practice their healing art in her spare time. Though she lived in the city, her heart remained close to the earth, just as her grandmother had taught her. But despite the new life she was building, Bolu couldn't forget the village or the lessons Mama Aduni had taught her. And though she was happy, there was a part of her that always felt out of place in the city, like a tree uprooted from its soil. Meanwhile, back in the village, life carried on. The people had not forgotten the king's broken promise, and they often spoke of Bolu and Mama Aduni with admiration and sorrow. Some even wondered if the king's actions had somehow cursed their village, for strange things began to happen in the land. The rains didn't come as they used to, and the crops were not as bountiful. It was as if the balance had been disturbed, and no one could quite put their finger on why. Then, 1 year later, word spread through the land once more. The king had fallen ill again. This time, his sickness was even more severe than before. The best doctors and healers were summoned to the palace, but none could find a cure. The king's condition worsened with each passing day, and soon he was bedridden, unable to eat or drink. Desperate, the king once again promised a great reward to anyone who could heal him. He offered riches, land, and even his crown if it meant saving his life. But this time, the people did not rush to his aid. In every corner of the kingdom, the story of Bolu and Mama Aduni had been told and retold. People remembered how the king had broken his promise, rewarding those who saved him with a few measly coins. The villagers whispered that the king's sickness was a punishment from the gods for his greed and ingratitude, and they were weary of helping him again. No one in our village will go to the king. He has shown us who he is, and we will not be fooled twice, they said. And so the king lay in his grand palace, growing weaker by the day, with no one to heal him. As the days dragged on, the king became more and more desperate. He could feel his life slipping away, and the fear of death gripped his heart. He remembered the time before when he had been at death's door and how the old woman and her granddaughter had saved him. How could he have treated them so poorly after they had given him back his life? Regret gnawed at him, and he could no longer ignore it. In a moment of clarity, the king called for his advisors. "Send word to the village," he commanded weakly. "Find the woman and her granddaughter who saved me before. I must make amends." The king's advisors did as they were told, and messengers were sent to the village. But when they arrived, they found that Mama Adune had passed away years ago, and Bolu had left with her uncle for the city. When the messengers returned to the palace and relayed the news, the king's heart sank. The news was a heavy blow to him. The one person who might have saved him was gone, and now he was left to face the consequences of his actions. He realized that he had squandered the gift of life that Bolu and Mama Adune had given him. The riches and power he had clung to so fiercely now meant nothing, and the promise of reward he now offered was hollow and too late. "Find Bolu," the king ordered his advisors in a weak voice. "She and her grandmother saved me once. Perhaps she could do so again." With great urgency, they traveled to the city, hoping to find Bolu before it was too late. When the king's men arrived in the city, they searched for days, asking everyone if they knew a girl named Bolu who once lived in a small village. Eventually, they found her at her uncle's shop, busy folding fabrics and serving customers. "Bolu," one of the king's men called out as he entered the shop, out of breath from the long search. "The king is gravely ill again. He has sent us to find you. He remembers how you and your grandmother saved him before. He begs you to return to the palace and help him once more." Bolu looked at the king's messenger, her heart heavy with memories. She remembered the long journey to the palace with her grandmother, the worry and hope they had carried with them. She remembered the king's broken promise and the small pouch of coins that had been their only reward. And she remembered her grandmother's quiet acceptance despite the injustice they had faced. But Bolu had also learned much in the past year. The city had taught her about the complexity of life, about how people could change, and about the power of forgiveness. Yet, it had also taught her to value herself and her worth. She thought of Mama Adune's words, "Kindness is a gift, child, but it does not mean you must allow yourself to be wronged." Bolu took a deep breath and faced the king's messenger. "I will not return to the palace," she said firmly. "My grandmother and I gave the king our help once, and he broke his promise. There is no more that I can do for him." The king's messenger, desperate, pleaded with her, "Please, Bolu, the king is suffering greatly. He has promised to make things right, to reward you properly this time." But Bolu shook her head. "It is not about the reward," she said. "The king had a chance to do what was right, and he chose not to. I cannot heal him again, for his illness is not just of the body, it is of the heart." With that, Bolu turned back to her work, leaving the messenger standing in the shop. When the king heard that Bolu would not return, he was devastated. He knew now that his illness was beyond any healer's reach. It was a sickness that had grown from his own actions, from the broken promises and the failure to show gratitude where it was due. The king's heart was heavy with regret, but it was too late to change the past. In his final days, King Olumide lay alone in his grand chamber, surrounded by the wealth that had once seemed so important, but none of it could ease his suffering or fill the emptiness in his heart. He thought often of Bolu and her grandmother, and of the kindness they had shown him despite having so little. The bitterness of his broken promise lingered like a poison, and he knew that it was too late to make things right. And so, King Olumide, the once great ruler of the land, lived out his remaining days in sickness and sorrow, a reminder to all that true wealth is not measured by gold or power, but by the goodness of one's deeds and the promises one keeps. As for Bolu, she continued to live her life in the city, carrying her grandmother's teaching with her. Though she had refused the king's plea, she did not let bitterness take root in her heart. Instead, she continued to help those in need, using her knowledge of herbs to heal the sick and care for the poor. Bolu knew that her true reward was not in wealth, but in the lives she touched with kindness, just as Mama Aduni had always taught her. And so, the story of Bolu, the poor girl who served the king and received a wicked reward, became a tale of wisdom passed down through generations. It was a story that reminded all who heard it that promises should never be broken, and that the greatest wealth one can possess is a heart full of kindness and integrity. Like this video and subscribe for more interesting stories. Thanks for always watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.